Good morning, everybody. I'm happy that I can welcome you at the second day of the World Organizations for Systems and Cybernetics Congress, organized together with the Russian Academy of Sciences. Today we'll have an interesting set of events. We'll start with keynotes, then we'll go to sections 1.2, 2.2, 3.2, and 4.2. I would like to let you know that the plenary sections are recorded and are being live streamed to Facebook, while the in-section communication will be recorded only for personal use, so it will be publicly announced. Yes, looking forward for a nice and vivid discussion. As a first keynote speaker, I would like to present Professor Clas-Otto Wene from the University of Göteborg, Sweden. And he will discuss operationally closed systems, develop eigenbehavior, and going into the learning curve spinner. And yes, Professor Clas-Otto Wene, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Igor. It is early hours for the retired professor, so I'm completely transparent when I say good morning to all of you. And thank you for this possibility to share some findings on learning curve and energy policy. Let us see now that we can get the technology working.
Looks like it's developing.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you maybe
and
please?
I just hope that I can get access to my it's blocking because I want to go into.
You should go bottom right. Go with the mouse. Just go to the bottom and to the right.
There, down.
Yes.
And it should withdraw it.
Yesterday,
it withdrew
if
very
you
nicely.
go a little bit, I will guide you. Go a little bit left, a little bit.
So
that's
there.
a bit too much. Down, down, down. There are some icons there. And
yeah.
the one this closest to minus, the next one right. You were almost there. You were almost there. Go down, down. Just 1, 2, 3 right. One more right. No, one more. No, no, one more right. Right. No, one more to the right. Ah, yes. Here you go.
There you go. Okay. So I want to start off the day with a cost comparison, which I admit doesn't sound too exciting, but in this case, the interpretation and consequences for energy policy is controversial. In the end, we shall find that it highlights a strange dichotomy between the internationally exposed theory and the theory in use in nation states for managing the risk of climate change. The comparison I'm doing is between the cost in 1980 and the cost today for a key part in a technology that uses renewable energy to produce electricity. 41 years ago, that is 1980, an investor would have to pay $16 US per watt for this element. In today's prices, that corresponds to $43 US per watt, and an electricity price of a staggering $8 to $9 US per kilowatt hour, or more than 100 times the market price for electricity. Today, the same key element can be bought in a mass market for less than $0.5 US per watt. Physics has not changed, so we can confidently conclude that the price has come down by 99%. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, quotes a price of 0.06 US dollar, or that is 6 US cents per kilowatt hour, which is well within the range of competing technologies today. Now, how did this happen? This is where the controversy starts. Proponents of mainstream economy insist that what we see is nothing else but producers implementing available features, events, and processes, that is FEPs, that can improve the performance of the technology. Examples of such FEPs range from waste reduction to economies of scale or findings through research and development. A standard econometric analysis explains the improvement, and the conclusion is that what we see is nothing more than happenstance. No safe conclusions can be drawn about future improvements or about emerging technologies. The cybernetic approach recognizes that FEPs are used to achieve piecewise improvements, but also observes that the remarkable regularities in performance improvement, not just in this particular technology, but in all technologies, and then comes up with a radically different explanation. What we see is a token of an emerging system property similar to all technologies. Safe predictions can be made about future improvements and about other emerging technologies. The different interpretations impact, of course, the design of energy policy. Now, to understand the cybernetic standpoint, let's go to the classical learning curve from 1936 of performance improvement. The technology element we are talking about is the semiconductor PV modules that are used in what we call solar PV technology, which converts sunshine to electricity. The learning curve stretches over more than 4 decades, from 1976 to today, and it shows in a double logarithmic scale, price versus cumulative global production. Here is the point for 1980, and here is the current point. Cumulative production goes from a few hundred kilowatt to 500 gigawatt, that is 6 orders of magnitude. The bold red line that you see here is the theoretical learning curve obtained from cybernetic theory. We can now follow the emerging solar PV based on the PV module from alpha to omega, from being ridiculed as too expensive to meter to cost efficiency in mass markets. I will use this learning curve for PV modules as an illustrative example throughout this talk, but I emphasize that our observations apply to any emergent technology. For instance, lithium-ion battery technology, which of course is a key element in the electric car. Now, how good is the price as index for improvement? In a competitive equilibrium market, we find a fixed relation between price and cost per unit. For our purpose, price is therefore a good index for cost per unit, which is our measure for improvement. And now we can go to make a cybernetic interpretation of what we see here. A system which we call the technology learning system manages the development of the technology. The learning system for PV modules is a global system. Cost is the cost of all the inputs needed for the production and the output, which I'm afraid I'm blocking the view to it. It's an example where the performer actually blocks his own message, but there I can assure you there's an output there. And it is measured in the unit of watt. So the ratio between input and output is therefore cost per unit, and also a measure of the performance of the learning system. The system is feedback regulated. Information on output is fed back to the system and accumulated. Later on, we will see that this feedback loop is actually consists of two orthogonal loops. But for now, we are certain that the learning curve is a log linear relation between the ratio of input over output and the sum of outputs. There are two constants, and unfortunately, Igor is now blocking my second constant. But it is there, and it's marked with P1s. So in the cybernetic theory, this additive constant, P1, is the only free parameter and is the only thing that is actually fitted to time series data. The theory has to explain the log linear relation and provide the value for the parameter E. This E is obviously an important parameter because it tells the speed with which cumulative output is transformed to performance improvement. It's usually expressed as a learning rate. That is the relative improvement of performance for each doubling of cumulative output. So we are now prepared to formulate a cybernetic hypothesis to be explored in a theoretical framework. Using what von Förster called the cybernetic closure theorem, we state the learning system is operationally closed, and the learning curve that we see there up to the left expresses its eigenbehavior. Operational closure here means that the learning system is in complete control of all its operations, but the system remains open as regards, for instance, information, physical input and output. Now, exploring this hypothesis means drawing out theoretical consequences and comparing theoretical results with empirical data. I claim that this process so far validates both hypothesis and the cybernetic theory for learning system and with the learning curve. A major result is the theoretical learning curve in a stable competitive environment. And that is already what you have seen, the red line there. The deviations is well understood, and I'll come back to them. The cybernetic theory is grounded in well-established theories of physics, namely non-equilibrium thermodynamics and quantum theory. Now, quantum theory may seem exotic, but the closure theorem actually suggests that the learning system is a quantum-like system. The theory is described in my contribution to last year's WOSC 2020 and in a paper available on the website. I will therefore in the following only point to some major findings and then proceed to the consequences for energy policy. The learning curve for PV modules illustrate two major findings. The first one, the learning rate, an operationally closed system in a stable competitive environment, has a learning rate of 20%, meaning that the price is reduced by 20% for each doubling of cumulative production. The theoretical learning curve explains empirical observation until 2004. It's there. Can you see this cursor? It is possible. And but what then happens after 2004? All these deviations from the theoretical learning curve. Now, this brings us to the second major finding. The learning system has double closure because the feedback loop from output actually consists of two orthogonal loops, one internal and one external closing of the markets. This concept of double closure is proposed by Heinz von Förster as the process by which the system can manage environmental perturbations by changing its eigenbehavior while still preserving its operational closure. So the turbulence after 2004 therefore shows how the double closed learning system manages environmental perturbations. And there have been two such interconnected perturbations, or if you want, two FEPs. The first one is the silicon bubble between 2004 and 2009. This bubble is a result of successful but not coordinated government deployment programs that boosted growth in solar PV, but also led to silicon shortage and to the price hikes that you see there, almost 400% increase in silicon prices. The bubble therefore actually indicates the need for concerted action among governments. I come back to that. The system managed the perturbations in two ways. The first one is trivial. As you see, prices for the PV modules were increased. The second one resulted in a re-entry in the spirit of Spencer Brown and Niklas Luhmann. The industry started to build factories dedicated to PV grade silicon, thereby creating its own FEP, which is in fact our second perturbation. When these factories came online, 2010, 2009, 2010, prices went down. The industry now integrated upstream. In system language, following re-entry, the learning system went through a structural change where it widened its system boundaries to incorporate silicon production. The learning curve now had to be renormalized, meaning adjusting the parameter P1. The result is a parallel displacement of the learning curve happening between 2011 and 2012. The existence of such parallel displacement was actually anticipated in my book from the International Energy Agency. That is the IEA 2000 there. So far, we have only looked at one technology, but the learning curve is a pervasive phenomenon. It applies to any technology with an autonomous, operationally closed learning system. We have already mentioned the lithium-ion battery technology, where measurements show that it moves at, you can guess, a learning rate of 20%, exactly like the PV modules. Now, this diagram shows how theory explains a measured distribution of the experience parameter, E, for 108 technologies and processes in a wide range of industries. The theory asserts itself. Double closure explains a distribution around the central value of 20% for the learning rate, corresponding to an E of 0.3183. Now, let us try to summarize where we stand regarding the status of the learning curve and the learning system. First, the learning system with the learning curve describes a stable and fundamental property of human systems of interaction acting in a competitive environment. Second, the learning curve expresses the eigenbehavior of the double-closed learning system. 3, the theory is grounded in non-equilibrium thermodynamics and quantum theory. 4, theory confirms the empirical relation between performance and cumulative output. And 5, theory predicts a learning rate of basic learning rate of 20% for all autonomous learning systems in a stable environment. Now, for completeness, one should also point out that the theory predicts that perturbations may cause phase shifts or jumps to higher learning modes, all with lower learning rates. But there are two unequivocally opposing views. The mainstream economics. The leading economist and Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus says in a paper from 2014 about the cost learning curves. They have a weak empirical foundation and can lead to misleading results for policy. On the other hand, the cybernetic theory is equally adamant. Learning curves have a strong empirical foundation and are reliable tools for policy. And this is where we stand right now. Let's now return to our illustrative example. I have used a break-even line that estimates the price which PV modules must achieve to be cost-efficient in mass markets for electrical technology. The reference for break-even is therefore the cost of producing electricity with the incumbent technology. I must emphasize that this is just a rough estimate. If you look at project level, break-even is a band rather than a line. But we will use a line to make an order of magnitude estimate of the investments in learning required to reach cost efficiency. By learning investment, I mean the additional cost for investing in the technology. The cost representing break-even would have to be paid anyway. Learning investment is then the difference between the actual investment cost and the break-even cost. This learning investment must be financed either directly by the government deployment programs or by niche markets where PV has a higher value because of its properties, for instance, in off-grid application. Now, this diagram shows the learning investment from 1976 until now for PV module. The bold blue curve shows learning investments for the actual learning curve, including silicon bubble and parallel displacement. For comparison, the thin line shows learning curves if prices followed the original theoretical curve with no environmental perturbations, that is, no silicon bubble and no parallel displacement. The area under the blue curve up until 2015, when we had cost efficiency on mass markets, gives the actual undiscounted learning investments. In today's prices, they are about 140 billion US dollars or gigadollars. There are three interesting observations. You first have the cost of the silicon bubble between 2004 and 2010. The difference between the bold and the thin lines provides an undiscounted estimate for the cost of the silicon bubble. In today's prices, it was about 35 billion US dollars, or 25% of total learning investment. So we have here actually an estimate of the value of concerted action among governments to avoid this type of price hike. The second one is a parallel displacement. The renormalization of the learning curve resulting in the parallel displacement of the learning curve moved break-even from 2020 to 2015. The value of this re-entry and ensuring upstream integration is remarkable. It reduces learning investments by $150 billion. Without it, the technology would break even only in 2020, and the learning investments would be a staggering $290 billion. One may, of course, speculate whether the silicon bubble actually was a prerequisite for restructuring and widening the borders of the learning system. That is the extra $35 billion spurred upstream integration. The third observation is about the regret. The logarithmic logic of the learning curve postpones large learning investments to the latter part of the curve, as you see here. Because early on, the learning investments per unit is large, but less units are needed in order to move significantly down the learning curve. On the policy message here is that there is room for early experiment. Regret costs are small. Now you can ask, how is this financing done? After all, the learning happens on a global level. Now I suggest that the operationally closed learning system is not just global, but entangled. Entanglement here means that no parts of the system can be treated separately. What happens in one part of the system mutually influences other parts. The system is coherent. This influences national objectives, which cannot be set in isolation. And this effect of entanglement on learning investments is shown in this figure. It is from the Japan rooftop program that went on during the 1990s and in the beginning of the 2000s. So we are in the mid part of the learning curve, actually. The objective of the deployment project was to buy down the cost for complete rooftop solar PV system to $3 per watt. The global learning investments to achieve this is fixed by the global learning curve. However, the share of these learning investments that are financed through Japan's deployment program strongly depends on what happens in the learning system outside Japan. Strong growth in the PV system deployment outside Japan reduces the Japanese share compared to historical growth, but in a stagnant market outside Japan, 80% of the learning investment must be financed through the Japanese deployment program. So we now have all the facts. We now have all the facts. Sorry. We now have all the facts about which nation financed what. This diagram shows the deployment 2000 to 2020 for the 6 major investors: China, Japan, India, Germany, Italy, USA. And the diagram provides some observations. The electricity consumers in Germany paid for the silicon bubble, and together with contributions from Italy and Japan, financed most of the learning investments up to 2012. After 2012, the relay was carried by China, USA, and Japan. Today, China is the major player, but the other 5 together still matches Chinese investments. So the financing of the learning investments for PV systems was a truly self-organizing collective effort, but it worked. Contrary to the internationally exposed policy measures with carbon tax, etc., deployment programs did work. Deployment programs brought a key non-fossil technology from too expensive to meter to cost efficiency on global mass markets. So relying on the learning curve did work. So what we actually see here, and this is my last slide, what we have identified is a strange dichotomy between the internationally exposed theory for managing the risk of climate change and the theory in use in nation states to do the same. The situation can be illustrated by this figure. The energy system is in the common center for two loops, but international work focuses on the right-hand side. Complex climate models calculate consequences of CO2 emissions, and economic models or energy economic models provide milestones to be reached for the energy system. But the milestones are placed in a roadless landscape. There are no roads to those milestones. The left-hand loop indicates how the roads to reach the milestones could be built. But the mainstream economist responsible for the exposed theory has only one advice: more public research and development. Public R&D is important, but it does not build the roads to the milestones. Industry builds roads, and the learning curve shows how industry and energy system can do road construction together. In the meantime, mainstream economists declare learning curves dubious and write out perilous for energy policy. However, the cybernetic theory marks learning curves as stable and reliable tools for energy policy. And moreover, as discussed in my contribution to last year's WOSC 2020, the existence of the learning curve seriously limits the applicability of fundamental theorems of welfare economy. So the dichotomy between the left and the right-hand side, the right-hand loops, should be bridged. The transition to a carbon neutral energy system demands both loops to be active. So here at this point, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clas-Otto Wene. Opening the discussion. Mikhail Kozlov.
Dear Professor, what may you say about global electricity nets on base sun energy, which now develop, for example, United Kingdom, England, Morocco, and China in the China on the and what prediction cybernetics on this item? It is in future it may be safe energy Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question. Do I understand it correctly that you are talking about the possibility of binding together national electric grids in larger and larger systems? That is how I understand your question. And first of all, I expect there to be a learning curve also for that. And so that would reduce the prices as we continue to accumulate experience on that. And it, of course, will also then be possible to have more of the, what do you call it, of technology like photovoltaic, like wind, etc., that are intermediate. It, of course, will also then be possible to have more of the, what do you call it, of technology like photovoltaic, like wind, etc., that are intermediate. Of course, will also then be possible to have more of the, what do you call it, of technology like photovoltaic, like wind, etc., that are intermediate. Of course, will also then be possible to have more of the. This is something happening here.
Is it only me, or am I hearing?
Yes, one is repeating the last sentences I made.
Obviously, we have some kind of echo here.
Echo, yeah.
Frankly, don't know where it's coming from.
Is it working now, or is my?
I can hear you better now.
I think
so. Let's.
Yeah, we can hear you better now.
Is it the? Well, shall I repeat my answer there?
Yeah.
I mean
maybe the last part was a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. The point I wanted to make that if the bigger grids you have, the better possibilities you have to offset the problems with intermittency from the renewable technologies. So that is I think is what's happening, for instance, in Europe today. And then secondly, if you really go to the very large picture, you have, of course, the whole of Sahara, not the whole of that's probably not possible, but you have a big source of sunshine in Sahara, let's say, that can be tapped for not only Africa but also Europe.
Clas-Otto, I just want to move you to the title of your presentation. You talked in the second line there about the Westphalian Treaty and its relation with corporate and international developments. Can you explain your understanding of the learning curve and all the propositions you have made in connection to the Westphalian Treaty?
Yeah, a lot of the Westphalian system with independent nation states. Well, I think there are two things to said. As I showed, there was a self-organization as regarding the learning investments. On that, you can comment that maybe Germany took a very large part of that investments, but so far they have pretty little industry to show for it. They still have of course one production plant for semiconductors in Bavaria, but the large part today of production of the photovoltaic systems are in China. The second comment to be made. Is of course, yeah, it is of course the relation between government deployment programs. There is a need to, in spite of this self-organization, there is, as the Silicon Bubble showed, there is a need for some type of government coherency. And the question is, of course, at the moment, there is no international organization who can handle such demand for common action among governments.
Yeah, Clas-Otto, as you know, because we have been talking about that in the past, we are running in this Congress in section 2.2, we are running a particular discussion of the Westphalian paradox and the connections between globalization and local decision-making, the problems of independence and autonomy. And basically, I would like you to make a few connections between that we are presenting later on with all these theories of double loop closure and all these aspects that you have enlightened us with.
Okay, so we will come back to that during the discussion this afternoon. Is that?
That's it. I just wanted to alert people that this is going to follow from your talk now, is going to follow into the discussions in section 2.2.
So basically, this is a great introduction for.
It's an absolutely fantastic introduction.
Okay, we can maybe squeeze in one more questions, but we are already a bit late. So if not, I would like to thank you, Professor Clas-Otto Wene, and hopefully you'll have a vivid contributions during the Congress. But now, let's give the word to Professor Ray Ison, and he will be discussing on the cybernetic community's contributions to human viability in the Anthropocene era, right? Professor Ray Ison, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation to give this address, and my congratulations to you in WOSC with your Russian hosts for bringing this event to fruition under difficult circumstances. It's been quite an achievement. So I'm just going to get... I'm placing in the chat function in a little while a copy of the outline of my talk. It'll be there at the end of my talk. So I'm not going to spend time on this slide, but I do want to talk to three sets of experiences that are shaping what I'm going to try to say to you this evening. The first is the experience of writing and publishing a book, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, captured in this image. So the talk I'm giving today draws heavily on that book, but of course I can say very little about a whole book. I'm also drawing on my experiences of a long period as a professor of systems at the Open University in the UK. The Open University is the UK's largest university. It's a distance teaching university with 250,000 students. And this year we are celebrating our Jubilee, 50 years of providing systems education in the UK. We particularly invested in a master's program in systems thinking in practice, and we have a series of activities associated with what we call our STIP at 50 events. I also want to inform you about some good news in England, where the government has created a whole network of apprenticeships. We have managed to get secure the creation of a master's level apprentice in systems thinking in practice. And in future, employers will be able to spend their levy to recruit these apprentices into their businesses. And I can announce today for the first time that the Open University, having helped to secure this initiative to professionalize systems thinking in practice, will itself be presenting apprentice education in this area from May 2022. And finally, the third experience I want to draw on is in my role as president of the International Federation for Systems Research, an organization of organizations committed to systems and cybernetics ideas, with over 40 organizations scattered across the globe. And I want to finish my talk today by returning to an invitation that complements the manifesto invitation that WOSC is issuing to you and that Igor mentioned yesterday. IFSR is the publisher of Systems Research and Behavioral Science, and I want to acknowledge the major contribution Mike Jackson has made to the editing of that over many years, for which we granted him a fellowship last year. And I'd like to point out, for those who don't know, that Dr. Amanda Gregory is the new editor-in-chief taking over from Mike. Okay. So we are living in unprecedented times. In the period in which WOSC has attempted to meet in Moscow, all have been subjected to the perturbations of pandemic, economic disruption, and changes in whole Earth dynamics associated with what we call the human-induced Anthropocene. These perturbations can be understood as wave fronts breaking on the shore of our historical ways of thinking and acting, buffered only by our historically derived institutions, the norms and rules we invent, and the governance systems we have also invented. Collectively, we must take seriously the question, what purposeful action will aid human flourishing, create and sustain a viable space for humanity in our ongoing coevolution with the Anthropocene biosphere? So that's the question I'm posing to you today. And I want you to consider my talk as a type of inquiry based on a metaphor. And the wave is the organizing metaphor. Some of you will have seen this cartoon before. I've used it on other occasions, but you can think of what we are confronting as comprising a series of waves: COVID-19, recession or economic activity failure, climate change, which I'm calling the Anthropocene biosphere, and also arguing is new to human history. In this cartoon, you can also see a theory of change and a framing of human behavior. And I'm asking you to think about what the institutions, the sandbags on the shore of the wavefront might be, and what our governance systems may be that are there to meet and deal with this set of wavefronts. The Anthropocene biosphere is captured, or what I mean by that is captured in this slide. If you think about yourself as a human being walking on the face of the earth, and then couple it with other human beings walking on the face of the earth, then you can get the gist of this image. We humans create or comprise a social system engaged in living on the earth. All those other aspects of the biosphere that are non-human. And the institutions and technologies that we humans have invented mediate the quality of our walking on Earth. And it's this co-evolutionary dynamic between humans and the biosphere that is really at stake in the Anthropocene. We are not in a task here to save the world. We are in a task here to save the relationship of human beings with the world. So I want to unpack these wave fronts a little with you. If we look at COVID-19 from a cyber systemic perspective, there are many actions that have been taken by management and by governments which fall short of cyber systemic intellectual understandings, and there have been very limited purposeful uses of many of our understandings and techniques. Let me just refer to purpose, and in the context of certainly Australia and Britain and many of the other nations that I'm familiar with, many actions taken by governments and by other interested parties have failed to be effectively systemically. They have failed to engage in the purposeful design of effective systems that can achieve what they set out to do. And in fact, there's relatively any clarity about purpose or contested purpose. So one can see a whole set of failings in the pandemic. Now, if we turn to the economy, and I want to just draw on this work by Jonathan Aldred, the economy and the whole idea of a recession has been in competition often with the biology of a virus. One is a social construct built on ideas and theories that we humans have invented. And according to Aldred, much of economic theory is conceptually, ethically, and practically flawed. And certainly the concept of Homo economicus, which is at the core of mainstream economic theory, is a very dubious understanding on which to proceed into the Anthropocene. So if we then move on and think about what windows can we bring to a theory of change about framing of human behavior? What about the institutions and governance systems that we have to deal with that are there to meet these three wave fronts and to deal with them? As we argue in our book, our current governance systems are no longer fit for purpose, and that we need to move towards second order change which changes the whole system. This is a simple conceptual model of a governance system as they currently exist. The relationships between the state, judiciary and law, private sector and civil society, with the media floating around in different places. In some nation states, the media is controlled totally by the state or manipulated by the state, sometimes by private capital and sometimes by civil society. So this is a heuristic to begin a discussion about what our contemporary governance system is. And we demonstrate in our book how you can use this and unpack it to different levels of system and subsystem and the relations between them. So why is this failing? Well, the elements and the institutions and practices that put them into operation were developed before the rise of multinationals, bigger than 70% of nation states, invention of technologies that enabled global connectivity, a 24-hour news cycle, and massive and quick financial flows. Before we became aware that we humans are responsible for the technosphere, all of that stuff, buildings, concrete, bitumen, etc., waste that we humans have put on the surface of the earth, and which in biomass terms now is as great as the earth has created itself. An awareness or acceptance that we humans have created the Anthropocene, that the biosphere is a human-induced Anthropocene biosphere. So what are some of the other reasons why? Well, we've also spent much time treating the environment as an externality. Mainstream economic theory has forced us into that, rather than absolutely essential, that which surrounds us and in which our living proceeds. We've replaced governance with politics and we've allowed technological innovation to be driven by laissez-faire capitalism. And we have loss or sublimation of our human systemic sensibilities, the relational dynamics that characterize the young mammal living in love and reciprocity, and little or no investment in systems literacy and the enabling of systems thinking and practice capability. So the argument we make is that we need to reinvent this governance diamond by adding 3 extra elements and different relations between them, with the biosphere as central, taking responsibility for the technosphere, and inventing institutions and processes and understandings that negotiate and articulate and re-articulate social purpose in an unfolding relationship with the biosphere. So now let me turn to the question, what contributions can be made by those of us who are here today who consider that systems or cybernetics and complexity thinking or practice or science have much to offer at this particular time? What do we have to do? What pathways will cyber systemic practitioners build into the future? We are, as I would argue, at what I call the great intersection of the 21st century. What baggage does the cyber systemic community need to abandon, adopt, or invent so as to enable a transparent, collaborative co-inquiry that makes a major contribution to realizing and sustaining viability in our living in ways that are peaceful and respectful of each other and the biosphere, is how I've framed our situation. But one of the things we have to be aware of, and one of the baggage items we have to give up, is the idea that there are pathways already established which we can choose. Because we humans lay down the path of our own walking. There are not pathways ahead to be chosen. And we live each day in the unfolding of our traditions of understanding, out of which we think and act. So each of us operates in relation to these waves, and we will engage with dealing with these waves and wave fronts through the particular windows we build onto the world, which are both personal, cultural, disciplinary, and intellectual windows. But they are all human windows, and we need to think critically about the architecture of these windows. Now, this slide is actually the start of an animation. I'm going to invite you to watch it. It takes 8 minutes. It's prepared for our mature age students at the Open University. And in watching it, I'd like you to imagine yourself as a student new to this module or course, engaging with it. This wasn't designed for you specifically, it was designed for them. But I think you will find it of interest, and it raises questions that I think we collectively need to address.
It worked the previous time, but it seems that now we are without sound. Have you been sharing that with Share Sound?
So, having committed to this module, what do you know about the systems field from which systems thinking and practice STEP is drawn? Terms like physics, biology, or philosophy have been used to refer to an intellectual or disciplinary field. This animation explores your appreciation of the systems field, where you draw boundaries around the field, how it is institutionalized, what future trajectory do systems have, What are some of the approaches used in the field, and who are the practitioners who have made the field? I will use the term field as in the broad notion of a field of study or scholarship. Where STEP is put into practice, I will call that a domain of practice in which an approach or approaches might be used. Part of the systems territory can be found by scanning the book Systems Thinkers. This reference book can support you in adding depth to your understanding of systems ideas and to explore where the users of STEP have come from. By the end of the module, you should have developed a general overview of systems intellectual traditions and be familiar with the ideas and influences of several of the main thinkers. If these biographical accounts and extracts of authors' writing capture your interest and you have time to read more, a deeper engagement is likely to be useful in your overall understanding of STEP. You will not be able to study the material in Systems Thinkers in detail within the study time allocated to this module, but it is useful to have as background material. This animation is one of many ways of understanding the systems field. It unpacks material that can be found in Chapter 2 in Systems Practice. It is my take on the field, designed as a form of trajectory diagram that accounts for many contemporary systems and cybernetic approaches that exist in the public domain. It is important that the figure around which this animation is built be understood as a heuristic device, not a definitive map of the entire field. A heuristic device is designed to facilitate conversation, inquiry and learning. Like all models, this one has some limitations which are explored in my book Systems Practice. There is no right way to depict the different systems lineages, and each depiction possibly says as much about the author of the heuristic as the systems field itself. This animation builds up a heuristic that is best read from right to left. It begins with a set of contemporary systems and cybernetics approaches which are written about, put into practice, and sometimes taught. I now use the term cybersystemics in this heuristic to talk about the field. This term is a boundary expansion, one that expands to include both cybernetics and systems, and as you'll see, complexity as well. Some names of people, STEP practitioners, associated with particular approaches and lineages have been added, though the choices are far from comprehensive. For example, there are some systems scholars and practitioners from various parts of the world not in the current version. These could be added. If one does a search, all of the systems approaches listed in this part of the figure can be found, with a reasonable literature associated with each. All of these approaches build on prior systems scholarship, a set of different lineages. On the left, formative clusters are identified that have given rise to these contemporary systems approaches. The first is practical holism, inspired by the work of Jan Smuts, a South African writing in the early part of the 20th century. The second is general systems theory, or GST. One of the champions of the field was Ludwig von Bertalanffy, a biologist who was concerned that science was losing sight of the properties of whole organisms, was becoming too reductionist. GST was a project to build a general theory of systems that applied across different disciplines. The next is operations research, or operational research in Western Europe, which developed as a field during the Second World War when complex logistics operations had to be planned and managed. Cybernetics is the next major influence. It comes in two forms, first and second order cybernetics, and is the field in which complexity science had its origins. There have also been influences on contemporary approaches coming from science and technology studies, including futures, foresight, and scenario practices. The cybersystemics field has drawn on understandings from many disciplines, and particularly scholars and practitioners keen to work in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary ways. Cybersystemics can be seen as having emerged from interdisciplinary studies to assume a paradoxical place, being both a discipline in its own right, but also a transdisciplinary metadiscipline, applicable across all domains of human activity, a bit like mathematics. By following the arrows backwards, it is possible to get a sense of some of the different lineages, though rarely are they as simple as depicted here. It is not possible to describe all these influences or approaches in detail, but it does capture a way of understanding the systems field. Importantly, a field of study is made by those who practice it, who take up understandings and practices of others and make them their own. Practitioners also add to what has been done before and thus generate new approaches. It's not uncommon to find first, second, or even third generations of approaches, so always check for updates before assuming what they do and don't include. Modern innovation in STIP can only ever flourish if the success and failures, constraints and possibilities of those who have gone before are well understood. Otherwise, we are likely to commit ourselves to approaching the future with eyes wide shut. The practitioners shown here include Talcott Parsons, Kenneth Boulding, C. West Churchman, Stafford Beer, Frederick Vester, Margaret Mead, Ross Ashby, Donella Meadows, Umberto Maturana, Gregory Bateson, and Peter Checklin. In systems work, there is always a question of what is in or out of your system of interest. There is rarely a right answer, just different answers. For some, the traditions of lean and agile sit outside the lineages of influence on major contemporary cybersystemic approaches. For others, they are contributing lineages, largely springing from the work of W. Edwards Deming. The approaches are organised from top to bottom in terms of what are perceived to be one of two common commitments or tendencies of a majority of practitioners within the given approach. These commitments are to see systems as real entities, systems as ontologies. The alternative is to see systems as constructs or epistemological devices that enable learning and change in situations. These terms and their differences and implications will be discussed in Part 2. Please remember that this figure needs to be understood as a heuristic device, not a definitive map of the cybersystemic field. This version of the heuristic has been through many iterations as a result of conversations, inquiry and learning on my part. After seeing an earlier version of this figure, some people became concerned that something or someone was missing. If this is also the case for you, then it helps to make the point that, like all disciplinary fields, cybersystems is not a homogeneous field. How it understands itself, just like physics or psychology, is contested. So please feel free to take this figure and adapt it as you see fit as your study of systems deepens. Do look for other examples of describing the systems field. As your study progresses, you may find it useful to return to the question of where systems as a field is heading now, or might head in the future.
Okay, thank you for your patience with that animation. You will have been conscious, of course, given our context in Moscow, that there was very little mention of the historical traditions, Russian traditions. And I'm only exceptionally sorry that I have not been able to pay my first visit to Moscow to begin to remedy that situation by immersing myself more in Russian traditions. But the same may also be said of China as well, where there are important intellectual contributions as well. But my reason in drawing this attention to your attention is that I think we have to take responsibility in all of our meetings and our articulations of our ideas, where we are coming from, whose shoulders are we standing on, what are the assumptions we're making, what are our particular commitments that arise from our history that have given rise to our individual traditions of understanding out of which we think, act and make claims. This requires a greater level of critical reflexivity amongst us, I would say. Now, let me just give an example of why I think this is important. Some of you will know about the Club of Rome as an institution. You'll, I'm sure, have heard of the Limits to Growth work. But perhaps you don't know the full drama associated with the early stages of the Limits to Growth work. The young Club of Rome, under its director Aurelio Pecci, the head of Fiat, commissioned a study which became known as the what it became, the predicament of mankind, it was called. This was put together by Hasan Özbekian, an American-Turkish cybernetician based in California. His report gave rise ultimately to the Limits to Growth report. He argued in that report that the global problems that he identified, the problematique, of which he listed 46 major ones, cannot be solved within electoral cycles. They can't be solved within individual countries. They can't be considered separately. They had to be considered systemically. And the problematique thus sums up this inextricable net of long-term and global problems. And as my colleague Huda Kayam said in her talk yesterday, if you understand the French word problématique, it's not only a sort of list of problems, but it's a way of engaging with these issues. It has a praxis or a practice element to it. They argued in this report, the source of our power lies in the extraordinary technological capital we have succeeded in accumulating, the all-pervasive analytic or positivistic methodologies we've used. Our achievement has, in some unforeseen, perhaps unforeseeable manner, failed to satisfy those other requirements that would have permitted us to evolve in ways that, for want of a better word, we shall henceforth call balanced. Now, if you look at the report, The Predicament of Mankind, all of the arguments are as relevant today as they were when they were made in 1970, and the 46 issues are still present in the world we live in today. In fact, there are many more one can add to the 46 in this document. Now, what happened in this unfolding drama? Well, Aurelio Pecci wanted to make a big impact. And rather than pursuing Özbekian's strategy to deal with the problematique, influenced as he was at that time by understandings, Rittel and Weber's concept of wicked problems, he envisaged an approach which engaged with governments and with stakeholders and may or may not have drawn on modelling. But Pecci didn't think this would be strong enough and have enough impact, and so he commissioned the Systems Dynamics group to produce the model that led to the Limits to Growth report. So in this, and there was quite a bit of conflict. Özbekian and his group left the Club of Rome, and it's a story that's not particularly widely told. It doesn't appear on the Club of Rome website, for example. And one can understand what was happening here as in terms of these distinctions I'm making here between being systematic and being systemic. I argue that we live in a world where the systematic paradigm of simple cause and effect dominates our thinking and dominates our world. And even though the systems dynamics model, as we have here on the right, is a systemic approach, what happened was that the model itself becomes embedded in a linear model of knowledge transfer. So it becomes default a systematic issue to sell the Limits to Growth report or to sell the model. And despite the model being very accurate, it has had no effect on changing how the world is engaged with concepts of growth, nor has it really helped us get 50 years ahead of the Anthropocene problematique. So one of the issues we have to deal with is that of the trap of systematic tool, technique, or model-led innovation. It's the interplay between the hammer and the hammered. What was hammered by the Limits to Growth report? Nothing terribly substantial. So in the work we do, we argue that there's a need to understand the systematic and the systemic as a duality, as a totality, but we need much greater investment in the systemic and to push the systematic back into specific contexts where it might be appropriate. So my invitation to you all is to consider what it means to be ethical, to be epistemologically aware, and to take responsibility for the lineages and traditions of understanding out of which we each think and act. I want to share with you my statement of responsibility for myself. Not that I want to convince you that I'm right, but I want to say that these are the commitments I hold to in how I think about the world and engage in my research and scholarship. First of all, as a practitioner, I'm embodied and always situated. We are all that. Then all observations require an observer. Everything said is said by someone, and we humans live in language. All knowing is doing. All being, knowing, and doing is relational. All observers, practitioners, actors have a history, a tradition of understanding out of which they think and act. Institutions and technologies mediate practice. We humans live with a desire for explanation, and science is a practice which realizes scientific explanations, which arises in culturally specific ways. So, as I draw to a close, I want to reissue this question. How can we make a difference? How can we be aware and responsible for what we do when we do what we do? Can we imagine ourselves, perhaps under the aegis of the manifesto development by WOSC, but certainly with the input of the International Federation for Systems Research, becoming a critical social learning system as a collection of organizations with members or individuals who agree to act together as a coherent group of people who are prepared to collectively learn their way through an issue that they all agree is problematic in some way or another to them all. And how can we collectively contribute to unpacking, to deconstructing, to deframing the assumptions that are built into these waves, into COVID-19, into the ideas of the economy and recession, and to climate change and the dynamics of the Anthropocene. How is it being framed? Who's framing it in that way? What are the constructs about human beings that are built into the understandings? And how are biology, ecology, and human co-evolution with a virus being understood? To what extent can we recapture cyber-systemic understandings that may be more relevant to our circumstances? Here are just a few examples from my experiences in the community to which we belong. And in conclusion, can I issue an invitation in my capacity as president of the International Federation for Systems Research and ask what actions can be taken within the cyber-systemic community to enable greater solidarity based on mutual appreciation and respect for differences that make a difference as a sought-after contribution to beneficial transformative action. What role can the IFSR, an organization of organizations concerned with the doing of cyber systemics, play in enabling that emergence of a meta-dialogue with impact, i.e. fostering and facilitating emergence that is greater than the parts? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ison. Thank you also on the invitation to participate in IFSR. You're doing a great job there. You're not trying to move mountains, and I think we're all on the same. No, we are not on the same side. We are scattered around the globe, but trying to pursue the same goals. We are a bit short on time, so maybe I would suggest some short, 1 or 2 short questions or comments. Maybe, you mentioned, in the end, you mentioned responsibility, which is the opposite of, not opposite, but it's complementary to rights. How do you comment that, there is an ISO standard on social responsibility. Sometimes it's referred as corporate social responsibility, but actually it's also a personal one. Can you relate to that?
Thanks, Igor, for the question. I understand responsibility as a dialectic between individual responsibility and a play on the English language, which has responsibility with response-ability in a cybernetic loop, that we can only be responsible if we have circumstances to be response-able. This is, I think, a central tenet of my educational philosophy. The role of an educator is to create the circumstances for their students to be response-able. And it's only out of response-ability that responsibility can be enacted. I've lived through too many university reorganizations in which people imagine that you're going to change your behavior or you can get trained to do something better because you are made more responsible. But what they fail to do in their training and their changes are create the structures and processes that make it possible for you to be response-able.
Basically, enable people to be active, not just expect people to be active.
It's about how you bring, in Maturanan terms, it's about how you create the circumstances for humans to bring forth what they're capable of doing.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mike is raising his hand.
Hi, Ray.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks for that. I agreed with 95% of it, so it's a bit petty to pick on the 5%, but it's my want, so I'll do it. Yeah, I mean, I like the explanation of the Club of Rome aspect and a sort of model out there, which then had to be sold in a systematic way. Similar criticisms were made of YASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, that it used to produce huge models of energy and the rest of it, systematic models that were then left there and had to be somehow sold. They weren't for clients or they weren't for decision makers. Akoff made that particular criticism. I just wonder, you started off with a model of a societal setup that wasn't working very well in terms of the politics and the legal system and the economy and the rest of it. And then you filled in some more blocks which would make it more appropriate to the current age and the Anthropocene. Isn't your model a bit like the Club of Rome model and the YASA models, in a sense that it's presented as being a right way to do things out there, which people accept or don't accept?
Thanks, Mike. It's a good question. To me, it's about how you do modeling and the practice of modeling and how you think what the outcome of a modeling process is. If the outcome is constrained to being the model, then it's a very limited understanding. But if a model is a heuristic or a way of engaging in learning and building stakeholders' understanding of things and built into, in my language, a designed purposeful learning system for transformation, then it becomes a different thing. And I would say the models I have about governance systems are models to try and generate a conversation about how we understand our governance systems. It's remarkably difficult to have a conversation about government and governance, I've found, particularly since writing the book. Most people fail to even grasp the language to begin to start having the conversation. So I guess I think we should have many more heuristics and ways of orchestrating that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are a little short on time. Before continuing, I would only like to mention that when the breakout rooms open, we added two small rooms, which can be if two persons decide that they need a short private conversations, they can reside there, have the conversation, and then go back to the section they have. Now, I would like to thank again Professor Ray Ison for the excellent presentation and for the discussion, and hopefully we'll carry on with that. But now I would like to introduce Professor Leonidov A.mp4 from the Institute of Control Sciences, and he will take us to the road to artificial intelligence, the current achievements, its perspective. Professor Leonidov, the floor is yours.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here, but I don't see a button to share the screen.
It should be in the middle of your Zoom. If you go down to the bottom,
yeah.
Now you
But
have.
I don't see it.
You have chat.
Yes.
And then next should be share screen.
Yes, but here is reactions.
So you don't have ability to share screen. Yeah.
This is a new version of Zoom.
You have a new version of Zoom.
Yeah,
can you try check again? Can you? Is it a browser or is it an installed one?
It's in the browser. This is a разговариваю сейчас.
Is it possible for you to share your presentation? Excuse me.
I have sent you my presentation
via email. But I obviously did not receive it.
Then I can try to send it to Yuri Slovokhotov.
It would. Let us do the following. Is it possible for you, Andrei Leonidov and Elena Malakova, to go in the room? One of the separate rooms. I will open the room only for you. Yes.
Yes.
And try to arrange that. If you, Professor Leonidov, if you can send it to Elena Malakova directly, and she will share it for you. Is this possible? And then we can we can continue with the discussion.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is a yes.
Yes. Can you find the breakout rooms?
Yeah, this is small room 2. Yes.
You're going to small room 2. Okay, this is good. And Elena will meet you there, and then you'll figure out how to support it. I'm sorry for that, but hopefully it will be resolved.
Igor, sorry, may I help? Leonid?
Yes.
Where is Leonid? I don't see Leonid.
Professor Kozlov?
Yes. Where is Leonid?
You may join them in room 2.
I may help.
Yes, but Professor Kozlov, you may go to room 2, small room 2, and there you'll find Professor Leonidov and Elena, and they will, and you can join the conversation with them. And in the meantime, we'll just I'm pretty sure that there are many questions for Professor Ray Ison, and we can continue the discussion. Do you agree with that? Okay. So, Ray, you're still here, right? Perfect. Anybody has some kind of
Igor, Shan has.
Shan has. Shan
Yes.
Turnbull, please
Yes.
continue.
Ray was answering your question about accountability, and I want to invite Ray, might he get down to details, specific details, and said you've got to make people responsible. And we've had a discussion yesterday about bottom-up governance. And so I'm suggesting that one way of making people accountable is writing organizational constitutions so those at the bottom have the power to act rather than acting at the grace and favor of a command and control dictatorial hierarchy. So that's my question to Ray. Would he supplement his answer to you by we need to change the power structure of society to allow everybody, the 8 billion people on the planet, to stop degrading the atmosphere, the soils, the water and the biodiversity.
Thanks, Shan. I mean, I agree with you totally. In fact, there are probably very few things we disagree about, but we just haven't talked about them.
Thank you.
In our work, we've done a lot of work on institutions and institutional design and other things of that nature. And this is, of course, a critical aspect of governance, and the rules about boards and other things are key institutional initiatives. I mean, we live in a country where in the 1900s, citizens came together to create a constitution and create a federation and write a constitution in 1900. Now, how many people would want to exist on a 220-year-old piece of technology, which is a constitution invented in 1900? This is just absurd. A constitution is a human invention, and if the circumstances change as they have, you should change the constitution. So I would argue we should have a constitutional inquiry or committee in perpetuity. It should be meeting all of the time, drawing in people from a diverse range of backgrounds and contexts and status and socioeconomic things, and revolving, but with a charter to look at and renew a constitution over time. And this is going to be critical in the Anthropocene, because the thing that's coming at us with the Anthropocene is exceptionally rapid change and high degrees of variation. So many of the rules that we have made and the institutions we've invented in the past, particularly with standards for design and technology and for human health, are going to be thrown out the window because we're going to meet excesses of temperature, of rainfall, or of other things that are going to blow these historical institutional arrangements out of the water.
Can I turn it back onto your responsibility as chairman of research and at Open University, that you should be providing an educational course for governance architects to learn how to design those constitutions so that you can have a continuous social inventions of sharing the power from the bottom up, like you've got, you know, like the John Lewis Partnership and so on, what we discussed the other day. So I'd throw it back to you to provide intellectual leadership and management of constitutional design on a continuous basis. Pretty please.
Well, I'm trying to celebrate our success in launching apprenticeship, master's level apprenticeship education, where we will be able to work with students in companies. And some of the things you speak about are already in our educational systems, but universities are terribly blunt instruments for innovation, in my experience. And if you can identify some funders or some philanthropics who are prepared to co-invest or invest in me creating those curricula, then I'd be only too happy to pursue it.
We'll talk later.
Ray, can you say a few words about...
Raoul, please.
Yeah,
we are kind of late on time.
Yes. Ray, can you just say a few words about democracy? Because somehow everything you have been saying relies in the fact that democracy doesn't work as it is required by the cyber systemic approach.
I'm awful sorry, but we are short of 15 minutes for the next speaker.
Okay, and where is Yuri Leonidov? I can't see him, unfortunately. Is he here?
Yes, Andrei Leonidov is with you. But let us just close the Elena.
Yes.
Let us just close the loop and answer the question. I'm pretty sure that Ray will be brief, and then continue.
Well, there are multiple forms of democracy, and we need to. That's a long conversation, Raoul, and a simple answer would not suffice, because democracy is in the arrangements one makes and the practice of it. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. Again, sorry for the inconveniences. I do hope that Elena will be able to share the presentation.
Yes, of course.
And yes, now we are introducing Professor Andrei Leonidov, and he will be speaking about, again, artificial intelligence, achievements, perspectives, and I can see it is already rolling. So yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Igor, and good morning or good day, everybody. I apologize for these technical difficulties, but when you install the very newest version of something, then there's always a chance that it doesn't work. So as you see from the title, the subject is sort of immense, and so this will of course be a very personal view on the subject. So with this remark, let us start. Next slide, please. Could you please roll the slide? Yeah. Okay. So main points of the talk are, so we'll first discuss the main issues that AI face, namely accumulation of knowledge, and we'll discuss in particular knowledge graphs and a multifaceted subject of learning. The first subject is having close ties with knowledge graphs. This is graphical neural networks. Another modern and active subject is a multi-agent reinforcement learning based on game theoretic considerations. Then we'll touch upon learning from brain. So I will shortly discuss what is called active inference, and a couple of issues that are related to theoretical physics, in particular statistical physics, which statistical physics, some aspects of deep learning are becoming more transparent. And finally, we'll discuss a future role of AI through the lens of economic forecast as seen by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Next slide, please. So let us briefly touch upon phases of AI development. At present, we can state that what is related to so-called sensor intelligence, meaning speech, vision, understanding of text, generation of text, this is basically at the human level. And an immense breakthrough of recent 5 years was that what is called strategic intelligence, in particular strategic intelligence in playing games. Strategic means planning ahead what is optimal. And so in chess, Go, poker, which was a great achievement 2 years ago, and this is already beyond human level. As to AI development in the future, we expect massive deployment of weak AI. Weak AI is something that uses sensor intelligence in a broad way, and this will happen in 5 to 10 years to come, and a creation of strong AI, when in addition to sensor intelligence, a large-scale goal formulation and planning, and an ability to communicate in natural language at a human level, this is expected to come in 10 to 20 years. Here, of course, one has to be cautious because many forecasts related to AI were widely inaccurate in terms of time scale, and it can be that this creation of strong AI will take more time, but the current consensus is that something real or really working will appear around 2030. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates, or just numbers, AI applications, and this is just to show that many applications are already running, and from simple things like virtual personal assistant, although it's not that simple, to quite sophisticated like deep learning or wide deployment of NLP, natural language processing methods. So next slide, please. Now, a very important point on AI is that as a science, as a scientific discipline, it should necessarily use experience and results from many branches of science, and here I have listed some of them. Computer science, of course, from applied maths, these are primarily issues related to optimization. Very close relation, and very important is game theory. Actually, the importance of game theory has dramatically grown recently because multi-agent reinforcement learning, which is a modern phase of reinforcement learning technology, is based actually on game theory formulation, in particular on using language developed in describing stochastic games, then statistical physics of complex systems. There are already 5 to 10 very important results on a theoretical understanding of deep learning, deep neural networks that directly use methods from statistical physics, and very interesting relations to neurophysiology, in particular learning mechanisms in brain and active inference, and we'll touch upon it shortly. Next, please. Now, let me give you 2 examples of current applications of AI that I find really astonishing. The first example is an unsupervised monolingual machine translation. Of course, you know that you can do machine translation from one language to another language by using large corpus of annotated, labeled text. And it turns out that already now one has a technology that does it in an unsupervised way. So you don't need labeled texts. And what you do, you develop a compact representation of a sense of a sense, so to say, of a sentence, and you project it into some, and so you formulate it in some universal form. And then you use another connection to the next language. So they are connected. Two languages are connected through the same intermediate universal form. And so you have this coder-decoder system with this in between object. And an example is given in the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is a translation from French to English, and you can see how this procedure enrolls. And now for quite large texts, this technology is already working at the level of with the speed and quality of technologies based on usual technologies, so based on labeled texts. And I think that in a few years to come, this will work better. But the mere existence of this technology is already astonishing. The next example, next please. Yeah, now I'm sorry, this first comes the question of learning of how, and this, I need to show you this slide before discussing the Go example. The main route to learning in modern machine learning is so-called deep reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning means that you use stimulus or stimuli of some kind, and this stimuli help you to organize a feedback loop that allows you to learn, and then as a result of this learning, you develop an understanding of the so-called policy, meaning, or in simple terms, probabilities of choosing particular strategies. Next slide, please. And this, just as another remark, this reinforcement learning mechanisms has deep connections both to game theory and control theory. And the modern version of reinforcement learning is actively enriching itself from both of these fields, and this is in particular important for multi-agent reinforcement learning. Next, please. Now, a great breakthrough was a situation with the Go game. It was thought that computer would either never beat human champions or will be able to do it at the end of the century, but this happened a couple of years ago, and this was achieved by the program called AlphaGo, which used deep neural networks embedded into the process of reinforcement learning. So this calculation of optimal policies was actually done by using neural networks, deep neural networks as an agent. This was done without any human guidance, and remarkably, the algorithm did find some strategies that were never used by humans, and the modern version of this AlphaGo 0, which is AlphaGo 0, reached really superhuman performance, beating, as you see it, 100 to 0, 100 to 0, against the previously published champion defeating AlphaGo. So the modern version has beaten even the version that has beaten humans. Now, with all this, I mean, this is of course remarkable, but here one should note that in terms of computational necessities, this is extremely demanding, and it is clear that human brain solves problems of this kind much more effectively. Yes, humans cannot beat computer in the game with well-defined rules, but the price for beating humans is also very, very heavy. So this is a caveat which is important to carry. Next, please. This is a graphical illustration. What happens at every next step? You switch on your neural network, reassess the current policies, and with a look forward with a certain depth, and this is how the game enrolls. So this is really like what you're accustomed to, or almost what you're accustomed to in Markov decision process when you do it when you do it stepwise. And in contrast, human brain has a hierarchical picture of the game that includes a big view of, or both big, medium, and local views on what's happening, and this is completely absent in this mechanism of reinforcement learning, and this is why it is so computationally demanding. Next, please. Now, AlphaGo, in this Go example, a player actually plays with him or herself, and modern applications or more complex games like poker need to consider a system of many agents that are simultaneously interacting with environment and have to take into account the existence of other agents. So one has to do this next step of describing multi-agent reinforcement learning, and I think here it is very clear to everyone that this comes so close to game theory that should be indistinguishable actually from it. I'm not sure that game theory has formulated everything you need for this, but it is clear that fundamentally the science or this field of multi-agent reinforcement learning it requires development of ideas from game theory, because this collective, the notion of a goal of this process is actually some kind of game theoretic equilibrium. Next, please. Now, this is a slide that illustrates how this field developed, and you see that major developments happened in between 2016, and 2019. 2019 was a breakthrough year for multi-agent reinforcement learning. And this poker, in particular, this poker game is a very, very complex thing. And the fact that this multi-agent reinforcement learning allowed computer to beat human champions is really a fantastic achievement, and one can expect rapid development here. Now, what I'm sure of is that this multi-agent reinforcement learning will have much wider implications as games. It does already have applications in, say, organizing interaction of aerial vehicles and problems like this, but I'm sure this will develop very, very, very fast. So now what we have is a working example of multi-agent reinforcement learning beating or surpassing human level. Next, please. Now, this just tells you what are the ingredients of this multi-agent intelligence, and as I already mentioned, what you need is necessarily game theory. You do, of course, need reinforcement ideas from reinforcement learning, which say that this is not a static subject. This is developing. The methods are becoming better and better, and the theory of reinforcement learning is progressing. And deep learning is also a necessity because calculationally you are at the level at which you need. Well, currently these are deep neural networks. Deep neural networks is the only agent that you can use in accomplishing the task technically. Next, please. So what is important to stress is what is written here in small letters, that this modern AI is not just pure feature recognition, but it is also getting strategic flavor, not only recognition but also elements of planning. So this is a real step towards what will be the focal point of strong AI. Next, please. Sorry, this is the same slide. Yeah. Next, please. Now, technologically, in applying AI, you have to do two things. First, you have to store knowledge, and second, you have to use it in a particular way. Now, from the beginning of from the dawn of artificial intelligence, it was clear that the most effective way of presenting a machine readable from storage of knowledge is to use something like semantic networks. This technology was forgotten for some period because it was impossible to use it in practice because of actually technical limitations. Now, the modern computers allow to use it fully. So a knowledge graph is something that unifies entities, relations, and facts. And I should say from right here that it's not necessarily a graph. It can be a multi-graph, so you can have many types of relations between the same entities, and it can simultaneously or alternatively be a hypergraph where its edge is composite. So this knowledge graph acquires and integrates information into an ontology. This is another important subject that was discussed in the 60s, but now it is working in practice. And next slide, please. Here is an example of knowledge graph just to guide your eyes. A usual example. This is related to David Cameron. That for example, he is married to his wife. His wife has another node, and married is a relation. And this is how you can store the knowledge into a knowledge graph using some conventions. Next, please. Now, this slide illustrates the time development of an issue. The term itself, knowledge graph, appeared in 2020 when Google started to use it as the main engine for its search, which is really important because you have to organize your knowledge into something tree-like in order to be effective. Otherwise, the search is hopelessly complex. And nowadays, all big players like Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, all of them are having huge knowledge graphs that where the relevant information about this world is packed. And these knowledge graphs are so provide a foundation for the search. Next, please. Now, this is a technical description of methods, so we'll not go through this table. I'll just mention that in the simplest formulation, you use the so-called resource description framework. So that's construction using subject, predicate, and object. It's a very usual one. And then you need some kind of language with formal semantics that allows you to use this RDF triplets. And the standard choice is the so-called open web language. Next, please. And now this slide illustrates industrial applications, and in the low right corner, some current applications are listed, and you see that this list of applications is already huge. Of course, most important applications relate, I would say, to healthcare, to social networks, and to digital media, to some extent in transportation. But we'll have an example of an industrial knowledge graph, and this brings us back to the previous talk where Siemens was mentioned, so it will appear soon. Next, please.
Can I intervene a little bit?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now we should have the break, and within the break we should have the recording of Sergio Barile. What my proposal is, if we can use some of the break for Professor Andrei Leonidov's presentation, and move the Sergio Barile keynote recording into the lunch period. And that means that we will get you to the main room. I will close the rooms, and we do the presentation of Sergio Barile during lunch. I think this is an option to still stay in time, but yes, I would advise you to have a cup of coffee in listening to Andreas Leonidov presentations. Can we agree on that? Any objections? Okay, in this case, yes, sorry for the interruption, but
yeah. Thank you very much, Igor. I will speed up at certain points. Now a wonderful example of actually exploiting a large scale knowledge graph in industrial application is a Siemens knowledge graph system. In Siemens, the whole industrial process is organized around this knowledge graph. Next slide, please. Well, this slide, let's skip it. This just describes how they constructed, what are the sources. Let's move to the next one. Yeah, this shows you a process of creating. You see that of creating this knowledge graph. So you see that initially they have text documents. They have data from controllers, and all they have data describing, having data from controllers means that they have data on the industrial process in real time, and this helps them to create the ontology of their whole business. And then from using this ontology, they create this Siemens knowledge graph with appropriate nodes and relations. Next, please. And you see that somehow in this way, the whole process, starting from the notion of semantic vertex and then downwards, leads you to the knowledge graph. This is how they see it. Next, please. This also illustrates, this is another illustration of what I have just told you. And an interesting plot is the plot in the upper left corner. The yellow curve is a result of using this technology. This a result of optimizing some quantity relevant to the industrial application, and you see that in comparison to the red one, there is something. Well, something is achieved. Next, please. No, next, please. Yeah. Now another example, and I'll just briefly comment it. I have 2 slides, but we'll skip it. Is an obvious application of knowledge graphs is recommender systems. This is something that is working at Amazon, for example, where recommendations are based on the existing knowledge graph. Next, please. And again, next, please, because I don't have time to go through this. Yeah, just an important comment. As I told you, that this knowledge graph can take a form of a hypergraph, for example, where edges are composite. Next, please. So this tells you how it is constructed. From fragments, you create the knowledge graph, and then you come to services. But there is another important issue that you have to solve, namely, how do you improve this knowledge graph and include new knowledge? Next, please. And this is where reinforcement learning comes into game, and you see that a feedback loop has appeared. So from above we have facts packed into the knowledge graph form, and inside this knowledge graph we plug an reinforcement learning agent that works with this knowledge and enriches the target knowledge graph. Next, please. And this is where the technology of graph neural networks come in. An effective representation of a picture, one of the most effective representations of the picture is a graph with nodes symbolizing important features that you see. I don't know, for example, ears or tail or something like this. And the ability to pack the information from left to right in the compact form is crucial in an ability to embed it to organize an official embedding of this information into Euclidean space, which is currently something you need in order to use it. And this is what is done by graph neural networks. And then what is happening is that you can, for example, you can use subset of nodes which is labeled, which does already have labels, to give labels to other nodes. And so you can organize in this way, you can organize a process of learning on this graph, and also the process of adding new information to it. So the graph neural networks is a very modern way of organizing learning process or machine learning around the knowledge that is packed into a form of a knowledge graph. Next, please. Yeah, this is something that I told in words, so let's just skip it. Next, please. Yeah, just one of the technical remarks. Well, this was really an achievement. Embedding of networks creates matrices, basically, and you have two views on these matrices. First, it's a list of matrix elements, and a second view is a spectral view. So you study eigenvalues, and these are two different pictures that basically concentrate on low resolution and high resolution properties correspondingly, and a recent body of work, this happened this year, finally bridged this together. So one can say that in 2021 we finally have a picture for graph neural networks. Next, please. So this is an illustration of what I have just said. So next, please. Yeah. Now, in terms of applications, we already have many applications. First, to study systems in physics, so multi-particle systems, molecular physics or chemistry, image reconstruction, text analysis, social network analysis, and in terms of knowledge generation. All that is already working. This is very recent. So most of these applications were developed in 2020 or 2021. So it's a field that grows very rapidly. Next, please. Yeah, no, let's skip it. It's just it's too detailed. I don't have time for this. Now we're in a more theoretical part. So but due to time limitation, I'll just give few comments. The first is that the relation to neurophysiology is extremely important because human brain is in fact extremely effective in many ways, especially in dealing with hierarchically organized tasks. And it's interesting that at least this is what people think about brain now, that it uses all mechanisms of learning that we know, namely unsupervised learning in the cortex, reinforcement learning in the slope in between basal ganglia and cortex, and supervised learning at the cerebellum. So it somehow we have elements in place to break this understanding, or to concentrate on aspects of brain functioning using language that we understand. Next, please. Now, a really remarkable idea is to look at what is called active inference in brain, or this is a way to formulate it. The active inference is a process in which you use a feedback loop to improve your model of your probabilistic model. So it's a bias and inference in which you correct the model with which you are coming in. A remarkable feature of this is that all this can be formulated in terms of minimizing the so-called free energy. Here, free energy has to be understood in information theory sense, not in the physics sense, but the basic idea is always the same. Free energy is something that mixes entropy, so disorganization, and something like energy or organizing interaction, or interaction that is organized into some pattern. Next, please. And this is what I just solved. This is a feedback loop using an exact, more or less exact theory, which is variational, and in formulation it is close in spirit to Bayesian graphical models in machine learning, in particular to the mean field approximation to this model. What is, once again, what is important is that this free energy minimization is an organizing principle that allows you to understand practically all known aspects of how brain accumulates information and how it's dealing with it. Next, please. No, this is already told. Next, please. Now, one of the very interesting, I would say, breakthroughs in understanding of deep neural networks was an understanding that the process of information propagation in these deep neural networks has a phase transition embedded to it. I don't have time to go into details, but basically you all know that in neuron a neuron is parameterized by weights and one special weight which is called the bias. And then in the process of learning, you have this heterogeneous set of weights and biases. And you can have millions, or hundreds, even hundreds of millions of these numbers. And of course, it's a useful idea is to see what happens to a random system when say, both biases and weights are random and characterized by some standard deviation. And here it's a deviation of the variance of two variances for biases and weights, and you see a phase transition between an ordered and chaotic signal propagation. And the most interesting point is the most interesting line is this borderline in between the two, because at this borderline you have characteristic length of information propagation which tends to infinity. This is something that frequently occurs in critical phenomena, and if you manage to put the system into this regime, then information propagation in neural networks will be extremely effective. And another example of statistical physics technology, next slide please, is studying the phase transition. It's related to the same subject, but this is in viewing more closely the landscape of minima or extremal points of this energy or energy function or loss function of deep neural networks, and it turns out that there is an intimate connection in between the depth of this minimum and its structure in terms of having flat directions. And finally, the best picture describing all this is so-called jamming phase transition that's illustrated in the lower right corner. Now, next, please. Now, very, very briefly on economic effects of AI, which are, of course, tremendously important. And to be brief, next, please. Yes, this is an estimate of PricewaterhouseCoopers. Cooper, what are the regions that will benefit most? And you have to look at the upper right corner, China. You see that China is expected to increase its GDP by more than 25%. It is somehow self-explaining. Well, of course, one has to be cautious in interpreting, in literal interpretation of these numbers, but still. Next, please. Now, what Pricewaterhouse expects is three waves of AI deployment: algorithmic wave, augmentation wave, and autonomous wave. So the first wave we're living in, the second wave is coming and we are entering it already. Now the third wave is actually the wave of what is called strong AI. Next, please. Now this slide tells you which sectors of economy will benefit most. And well, it's clear that, say, transportation is one of them, healthcare, of course, but let me go to the next slide because there's one problem that I have to discuss. Now, of course, everybody worries about what will happen to the job market. This is the basic worry. And if you read a report of a group of counselors to the President of the United States, then you read something very grim. And the numbers are here, and you see the brown is this autonomy wave, and you see that what this reduction of or squeezing of job market that we witness now, which are these short bars, is insignificant with respect of what is coming in the nearest years in augmentation wave, and of course an autonomy wave. In transportation, we already see this reduction, but you see that it's up to 50% of the workforce will be struck out. And going down, education is something that is expected to be relatively stable, but even here, a reduction of 10% is expected. Next, please. Now, this tells you how this looks when you break the job market with respect to sex, age group, and education level. And of course, as expected, people with low or medium education will suffer most. Next, please. Now, this is a funny diagram that's telling us that we in Russia are relatively safe. I don't know how it happened. You see, Russia is the fourth from below in this PVC estimate. It's difficult to say how it happened, because they used a specific general equilibrium model to estimate all this, and I'm not sure this model has this accuracy, although general equilibrium models are relatively good when describing the current static picture. And so actually this we are, I think, behind the schedule, so apologizing once again for the technical difficulties. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leonidov, for the proficient and comprehensible presentation.